resistance party, and he fought the Japanese, and he later on became a part of, or aligned with the U.S. Army, and so he was in rank. He was with the Chinese Army, but this was after he'd gone through the resistance training and had become a resistance officer, and he was actually quite. It wasn't just the resistance as what a lot of times you sort of watch in the movies, where the resistance, they're all underground and they do things on the sly. They did that, but my dad was more, I guess, more of a spy in counterintelligence, if you will, and with the Chinese army. And I remember him talking and telling us, my dad, one thing you got to realize is with my family, food is a huge thing. It's the premise of everything in life, is everything surrounds food. So he would tell my grandmother that he was going with his friends to have some noodles, which my dad loved noodles. So he was going to go and have some noodles, and so she would say, okay, well, have fun with your friends. So they would go and have noodles, and while they were at the noodle place, they would have like, they would use things on the table like condiments and stuff, and as they were talking, they were actually plotting, and they were saying exactly where the Japanese were and sort of doing their counterintelligence work, but using the food and the condiments and the items that were on the table as the little guidelines of how they were going to proceed. But my dad said if my grandmother had ever known exactly what he was doing, she would have beat him senseless, because it was not something she actually agreed with that he should be doing. But so my dad was in the war, and he was attached to the Americans because he spoke fluent English. And when Puyi, the last emperor of China, was captured, he was actually the translator for the in the interrogation. So he translated the interrogation, was basically interrogating Puyi on behalf of the Americans via translation. And my dad was actually the one who coined the phrase the puppet emperor. He said that he's nothing more than a puppet emperor, and that's actually what exonerated as well Puyi, plus the fact that he was a puppet emperor, and he just had desires to rule and be the emperor again, and he didn't care where he ruled. So that was what my dad did in the war. And I remember my dad used to always tells a story about how when he was in the war, he was on the field and he got shot in the leg, and he went down, and his first thought was, oh my God, I'm dead. And I still remember the scar. Like he showed us the scar. It was on his thigh, and he said, but all they did was come and they put tooth powder into the wound and said, okay. They took the bullet out, they put tooth powder in, and they said, okay, get up and keep fighting. And he said, so it wasn't like you had any reprieve when you were taken off to the emergency and to a MASH unit or anything like that and shipped off home. It wasn't anything like that. It was basically, well, it's kind of superficial. Get up and keep fighting, and but that's how it was in the war back then. And after the war, there's so many stories that I could tell you, and I don't want to go into so much detail because it's not very long of a time that I have on this video, but. My dad was able to, he was very, very proficient in business. From a 10-year-old little boy, my grandmother had a boarding house, and my dad pretty much managed the place, and he took care of all the finances and the books, and he worked the books, and he managed a lot of the staff and stuff, and was inventory and things he took care of. So he was very, very proficient in that stuff from a very, very young age. And he started off with a company called Getz Brothers in Tingxing, and he did very well with them. He already had a lot of money, and so he did a lot of business. When the communists came, my dad had to flee with my grandmother and his older sister, and they fled to Taiwan. And he had to burn all of his paperwork, all of the land deeds and the history of our family and his title. He had to burn everything because when the communists came, they were looking for warlords specifically, one of the things that they were looking for. And if you were a landowner, you were a warlord, classified as a warlord, they would actually have taken him to concentration camp and either executed him or put him in for re-education. So they fled along with countless thousands of others, and ended up, they went to, I think they went to Shanghai first, and then from Shanghai they went to Taiwan. And my dad was married, and he had 2 children, and he and his wife ended up with the children, and my grandmother and my auntie, they ended up in Canada, and they were living in Montreal, and my dad became Canadian citizen. From there he left his wife, and he went to Hawaii first, and then from Hawaii he went to New York. He ended up in the Far East, in Singapore, Malaysia, places like that, but ended up in Hong Kong. And he was doing business in Hong Kong, and this was in the 1960s. And while he was in Hong Kong, he met my mum and fell in love. She actually applied for a job with him as a Girl Friday and became his Girl Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, all the way around. And eventually I came along, they were married, and then my dad went to work for a very large shipping company and still did business on the side. Growing up, I grew up in an extremely extravagant lifestyle. We had dinner parties almost every single night, cocktail parties, parties here, parties there, some kind of party. We traveled extensively around the world. I was actually born in England, but I was raised in Hong Kong, and I've lived in Malaysia. My first 2 years of my life were actually in Malaysia. And well, between Malaysia and Hong Kong, my grandparents were, my mum's parents were in Malaysia. My grandfather was a member of the Royal Australian Air Force, and they were posted in Penang. And so mum and I would go for 6 months, and then we'd go back to Hong Kong for a few weeks to get our visas renewed, and then return back then. We'll just continue for 2 years until they were posted back to Australia. And so I traveled extensively throughout the world with my parents, because when Dad did business anywhere, he found that when he was going for business, a lot of times the people who he was doing business with and his colleagues would take him to debaucherous places, and he never wanted to be a part of that, and he never wanted to have any kind of questions about him and his character. So he insisted that my mum and I would go with him, and he actually paid for us to go with them to all the different countries. And so we went on wonderful trips around the world, throughout the world, and sometimes we were gone for months on end. And I remember often waking up and not knowing which city I was waking up in, and my mum had the same problem, and of course I think Dad did too, to a certain degree, but he never really talked about it. Dad was he was extremely